We never believed that Paul was going to get through all those slides in the time allowed, but he showed you just what speed really is. I'm Peter Mayers from the Grattan Institute. When we talk about public transport, debates are often framed around questions of the economy, the environment and physical health, and we've heard quite a lot about all those things this morning. At the Grattan Institute, we're also interested in questions of social connection. So we did this report called Social Cities. Now, social connection, social impact of transport projects, partly of course it's about equity, and we've heard about that too. In a heavily car-dependent society like Australia, people who can't afford a car or don't have a licence experience greatly reduced mobility, and that limits their access to jobs, to education, to opportunity more generally. But our idea here about social cities goes further than that and also asks whether an investment in transport or a change in the way transport is organised will make it easier or harder for people to connect with each other. Now, this is important because we human beings are profoundly social animals. We tend to rank our needs when we think about things as material first and social second. And it's true, if you don't eat, you'll die, and if you don't have a roof over your head, you'll get wet and cold and sick, and you'll probably die as well. But the ranking isn't actually that simple. Our psychological needs are also fundamental to our well-being. So, for example, the Young Foundation in the UK has done observational field work with marginalised young people and found that they'll go for days without food in order to top up their mobile phones. And why will they do that? Because their phone is their connection to other people, and that connection is fundamentally important. Chronic loneliness and isolation can have serious health consequences with a similar impact to high blood pressure, lack of exercise, obesity or smoking. So our sense of well-being is as sensitive to loneliness as it is to physical pain. Above a certain level of base income, a small reduction in loneliness is likely to have a much greater benefit than a large increase in income. According to the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index, on a medium household income, it would take around $36,000 of extra income to improve well-being by just 1%. So we can see that from a public policy point of view, reducing rather than increasing loneliness is a good idea because it will lead to improved well-being. Now, this is a challenge because in our society, the groups of people most at risk of loneliness are increasing. People who live alone, older people and single-parent families. As you can see from this chart, people living alone are far more likely to experience loneliness in any given day or week. Now, we're not saying that everyone who lives alone is loneliness, but there is a greater risk. And as the number of people living alone increases, so the importance of creating opportunities for social connection outside the home become more important. What can we do to promote social connection in cities? Our report, Social Cities, looks at a range of approaches, including some of the things Kirsty was talking about fine-grained design of streets and buildings, what we do with open spaces like parks and squares, and the organisation of public events and activities. But our focus here at this conference is on transport and mobility. And as our chair, Professor John Stanley, has eloquently pointed out in one of his many articles, transport serves a greater purpose than merely moving people from one location to another. Mobility also enhances well-being by helping people to feel in control and autonomous, competent and connected with others and the community at large. The importance of mobility is recognised in planning schemes. Current Victorian planning guidelines, for example, stipulate that 95% of new residential land should be within 400 metres of safe walking distance of a public transport stop. Medical, educational and community facilities should be within 200 metres safe walking distance from such a stop. Now, there are two problems here. Firstly, many new subdivisions in Melbourne's growth areas fail to meet this standard. This slide is prepared by the City of Wyndham, and the green areas are residential properties that are more than 400 metres from a bus stop. According to the City, there are over 14,000 households that are more than 400 metres from a bus stop in Wyndham. If we zoom in a bit closer, we can see the extent of the problem in a specific area. This is Point Cook, where the population has almost tripled in 6 years, growing from fewer than 15,000 residents in 2006 to more than 41,000 residents today, and where there are around 6,000 households, more than 6,000 households that are more than 400 metres from a bus stop. But even if all those residents were within 400 metres of a bus stop, the metric itself is not very useful because it tells you nothing about how often services run, where they can take you and how quickly they can get you there. A quick glance at Public Transport Victoria's timetables shows you that there are 2 bus services operating through Point Cook Town Centre, the Route 413 and the 416. The earliest service of the day departs from Point Cook at 20 minutes past 5 in the morning. The last one arrives into Point Cook Town Centre just before 9 in the evening. So you wouldn't want to stay out too late. The 413 and the 416 run on different routes, with the latter taking in more schools, shopping centres and sports grounds. However, both services run between the same endpoints, the railway stations at Hoppers Crossing and Laverton, both on the Werribee line. During the week, the 413 and 416 arrive at and depart from those terminals at exactly the same times, and each with a frequency of 1 service every 40 minutes. Trains from Laverton, the closest station to Melbourne CBD, run at 10-minute intervals during peak periods. Now, I'm not criticising the operator here. This may indeed be the optimal service available, that's possible with the resources available. I'm not criticising the operator, but we can see from that description of the services available that if that's the extent of public transport in Point Cook, it's not surprising that people are not getting out of their cars. Where you can get to on public transport, as you'd all know, varies dramatically between different places and different times of day. This map shows how far you can travel on public transport in 45 minutes at different times from 2 different starting points in different parts of Adelaide, one in the inner west and one in the northeast. And as you can see, you don't want to try and travel anywhere very far on a Sunday at 6 p.m. I'm just going to skip a couple of slides here. Digital mapping gives us tools to develop much more sophisticated transport measures. For example, Queensland's Land Use and Public Transport Accessibility Index, or LUPTI, measures all modes of access, walking, cycling, public transport or car, to key destinations such as health centres, shops, banks, schools, universities and jobs. LUPTI can be used to build and compare plans for future land use and transport infrastructure. This is useful in identifying gaps in government service provision and access and figuring out the best way to fill them. For instance, a school or a shopping centre can be added to a model to see how many people could reach it by different modes of transport. It can also measure the impact of an additional transit stop or moving or adding a new public transport service, footpath, cycleway, or of changing the mix of land uses. So we can use tools like LUPTI to create better transport networks. If we don't improve public transport networks, then we'll further entrench car dependency. Not only will this risk increasing isolation and loneliness for non-drivers, it also risks increasing congestion. Point Cook, the suburb I mentioned before, is just off the Westgate Freeway and supposedly 20 minutes from the CBD. However, those residents who don't catch the 413 or the 416 say it can take them up to 40 minutes just to get onto the freeway at peak times because so many other drivers are trying to do the same thing at the same time. We know that long commuting times are negatively correlated with life satisfaction, and this isn't surprising. More time in the car means less time, or indeed more time on the bus, means less time with family, less time for social activities like sport or for volunteering, less time for social connection. And this brings me to another issue linking transport and social connection, and that's traffic. Back in 1969, a pioneering researcher called Donald Appleyard mapped the social connection between residents on comparable streets with different levels of traffic, low, medium and high. And you see the graph here, the low traffic street is the one at the top. And what those squiggly lines are the connections between households on the street. So what he found was that in the low traffic street, people had 3 times more friends and twice as many acquaintances living in the street than residents on the streets with heavy traffic. And you can see on the bottom heavy traffic street, the connections are much weaker. The heavily trafficked street had little or no sidewalk activity, while the street with light traffic had people using front steps for sitting and chatting, and there was play and casual conversation on the pavement. A recent study in Bristol duplicated Appleyard's findings in the 21st century, while a similar study in Basel found that it's not only the volume of traffic that's important, but also the speed. When traffic speeds up, as you can see from this slide, or when traffic speeds reduce rather, from 50 kilometres down to 20 kilometres per hour, people are about twice as likely to spend time talking on the street or supervising their children on the street. Heavy traffic and fast traffic clearly damage neighbourliness, and this matters because knowing your neighbours is a good proxy for levels of community satisfaction with your neighbourhood and for your sense of safety and well-being. Another aspect of mobility we've heard about in connection to active transport in relation to public transport is walking, and we know about all the extensive evidence of what walking can do for public health. But there are other benefits as well beyond the physical health benefits. It's like transport, walking is about much more than getting from A to B. As the Danish architect Jan Gehl writes, a multitude of valuable social and recreational opportunities naturally emerge when you reinforce life on foot. One component of walkability is the quality of the pedestrian environment. And this isn't just about having decent footpaths and safe crossing points, fundamental and important as they are. Less obviously, it's also about whether walking is pleasant or not. Is a street dominated by traffic noise? Are there trees for shade? Are there places to sit and rest along the way? Are there interesting things to look at? If a walk is visually stimulating, then distances seem shorter, and people walk more and spend more time on the street. Active street frontages, so shop windows, alcoves, things going on the street, active street frontages encourage people to stop and linger. Blank walls encourage you to walk faster and keep moving. There's no point in exhorting people to walk in hostile environments. We have to foster and create urban forms that invite us to walk. At an even more fundamental level, walkability means having somewhere to walk to, be it a park or a shop or a job or a school or a bus stop. And this is much more of an issue in newer suburbs built around the car than in older parts of the city. This chart is from the Grattan Institute's latest, the Cities program at Grattan Institute's latest report called Tomorrow's Suburbs, which looked at how well our future suburbs are going to adapt to demographic change. And it shows the change between 1951 and 2005 in the number of different land uses within 800 metres of any given spot in Melbourne. 800 metres can serve as a rough proxy for walking distance. So you can see that in 1951, 80% of the city had 4 or more different land uses within 800 metres. They could be a park or a school or a shop or whatever. In 2005, in recently built areas, so the far right-hand side of the screen, this had fallen to 27% of areas having at least 4 different land uses within 800 metres. So what this reflects is that is a much greater segregation of land use, and we've heard a lot about land use this morning. In recently developed suburbs, you have large areas of land that are devoted entirely to housing, other large areas set aside entirely for employment, and retail tends to be more concentrated and more centralised. We've moved from mixed-use walkable neighbourhoods to single-use car-based neighbourhoods, which reduces not only incidental walking, but also incidental social contact and interaction. And that suggests that if we want to increase social connection and mobility, we also need to think about the overall structure and shape of our cities. I'll conclude by saying that all Grattan Institute work is freely available and downloadable from our website. Thank you.